We'd like to thank First Things, Relevant Radio, and the Chicago Leadership Forum for co-sponsoring this event. Writer, critic, and scholar Randy Boyagoda is Professor of American Studies at Ryerson University in Toronto. His latest novel, Beggar's Feast, was selected as the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and nominated for the 2013 Impact Dublin Literary Prize, and has been published to critical acclaim around the world. His debut novel, Governor of the Northern Province, was nominated for the 2006 Scotiabank Giller Prize. He has written for a variety of publications, including the New York Times, Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, First Things, Paris Review, The New Statesman, The Guardian, Harper's, and Image. His latest book is a biography of Richard John Neuhaus, the Catholic priest and neoconservative intellectual, who was published last year to wide acclaim. He is currently working on a new novel which explores the dangerous role that faith can sometimes play in ordinary life, set in contemporary bourgeois Toronto. He lives in Toronto with his wife and 4 young daughters. And for Lent this year, he's told me he's giving up, leaving his wife on her own in Toronto with their 4 young daughters while flying around the world giving talks on Father Neuhaus. His Lenten practice begins tomorrow. I'd like you to welcome Randy Boyagoda.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much, Tom. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Thomas Levergood, as well, to Lumen Christie, to Relevant Radio, and to the Chicago Leadership Forum for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to have seen a copy of my novel, Beggar's Feast, which tells me now that we do have hard evidence of one U.S. sale. That is very exciting. I think really, though, I want to thank all of you for being here this morning on the first day of Lent, because in so doing, you affirm the ancient church practice of beginning Lent by listening to a bald Sri Lankan from Toronto tell you about a Lutheran from New York who turned into a neoconservative Catholic priest. I mean, for centuries, the church has started Lent this way, so it's so good to begin as such here in Chicago. What I'd like to do this morning is give you a sense of the remarkable life and work of Father Richard John Neuhaus, and the ways in which his vocation to public life took any number of different forms. In more immediate sort of newsworthy terms, as some of you may know, in recent weeks there's been a bit of a debate happening in the Catholic opinion pages, started by Kathleen Keaveney's article in Commonweal that accused Father Neuhaus. There it is right there, another singular sale, Commonweal, one sale as well. That started by Keaveney on the question of Father Neuhaus and whether he was a divisive presence within the American Catholic Church because of his openness to ecumenical alliances. And I can say more about this perhaps in discussion, but clearly the primary mistake that Keaveney makes, the grave error of her article, is that she hasn't read my biography, clearly. And if she had, she would have had a different view, I'm pretty sure. But let me now give you a little bit of a sense of Father Neuhaus. So what I'd like to do is just set the stage to give you a sense of his remarkable trajectory, and then I'll speak more informally about his life and work. I'll end with, I think, what strikes me as a key moment in his life that says a lot about what it means to put first things first and how he did so throughout his life, and then I'll happily take some questions and we can continue the conversation. So this is from the beginning of the biography. There was smoke and ash and great singing in the church that night in 1967. The pews were filled with left-wing radicals and their marijuana and cigarettes. They had come over from Manhattan to a broken-down corner of Brooklyn, along with some television cameras and reporters, for a service of conscience and hope, an event that yoked prayer and protest over the grave injustice of the U.S. war effort in Vietnam. During its signal moment, some 200 young men solemnly walked to the altar bearing their draft cards, which they deposited in a bowl. This was their symbolic and efficacious means of refusing to join the American war machine. Following the service, the cards would be sent on to the Justice Department. The young men walked forward amid much 60s-era atmospherics, but the church was far from silent. The long-haired people on the scored wooden benches were singing with everything they had. But this time, they were not running through one of their standard angry protest chants or cooing the latest soft-melt folk pain to peace. They were singing America the Beautiful, following the deep-voiced man of God presiding over the service, 31-year-old Richard John Neuhaus. He was the pastor of St. John the Evangelist, the thriving Lutheran church hosting the event. He was also one of the founders of a leading anti-war group, clergy and laity concerned about Vietnam, and a fast-rising intellectual and activist on the American left. But this trajectory would never be finally or fully his trajectory. The song he wanted his fellow anti-war activists to sing at St. John the Evangelist indicated as much. As he would later recount, his suggestion was met with silence, even shock. Asking this particular gathering to sing that particular song was basically like asking Billy Graham and Bob Hope to sing communist anthems at an Honor America rally. Neuhaus, however, was convinced prayer and protest could be joined to patriotism. In fact, at difficult and fraught times in American public life, they had to be, whether to rescue love of country from war-making scoundrels and other ugly conservatives, or to remind myopic pacifists and other sweet, dreamy liberals that they were citizens called by God and by history to love and help redeem their troubled nation, not hate it and abandon it to its hateful elements. And so this was why, as far as Neuhaus was concerned, nothing less than America the Beautiful had to sound forth in the church while all the young men said no to what their country was doing in Vietnam. Pastor Neuhaus preached to the hazy protesters in the hazy pews that the song did not describe the United States as it was. He told them it described the United States they all hoped for, the nation they hoped would come into existence because of the very acts of conscientious objection that they were committing together in the church that night. Provocative, contrarian, challenging, persuasive, Neuhaus won them over. What came of it, as New York TV news audiences and newspaper readers learned the next day, and as Neuhaus himself would recount in one of his many books, was, quote, one of the lustiest and most heartfelt renditions of America the Beautiful I have ever heard. Almost 30 years later, amid all the cheering and applause, it was everything Father Richard John Neuhaus could do to stop his admiring audience from belting out songs like America the Beautiful. He was in Washington to speak at the annual Road to Victory convention in September 1994, 2 months before the midterm elections. The event was sponsored by the Christian Coalition, a political operation dedicated to securing conservative Christian voters for the Republican Party by persuading them to put their electoral trust in the GOP. The 3,000 in attendance were certainly open to the proposition. As far as many conservative Christians in America were concerned, their beloved and God-blessed nation was now run by godless, decadent liberals, and unsurprisingly, going to hell. Public schools taught lefty nonsense and anti-American garbage in place of sound values and strong traditions. Popular culture was a sex-encrusted cesspool. You could abort your unborn child and claim it as a constitutional right more easily than you could quote the Bible at a public meeting or put up a creche at City Hall. Something had to be done about all of this, namely getting the right kind of people elected to public office. And if you were a delegate at a Christian Coalition conference, the right kind of people were Republicans. The coming election, however, would not be easy. The attendees needed encouragement, even blessings for their effort to turn out fellow churchgoers on Election Day. And who better to do it than the author of the national bestseller, The Naked Public Square, Religion and Democracy in America? Who better than Father Richard John Neuhaus to praise and inspire the God and GOP-loving crowd? He did not deliver the goods they may have been expecting. Instead, he warned his audience, quote, we can confuse our Christian hope with political success. Furthermore, quote, there is a danger that we confuse our policy judgments with the judgments of God. And the crowd went wild. It went wild to his dismay, as he would observe in one of his magazine columns. Here he was, challenging his listeners to recognize that the call of faith could not be collapsed into an election campaign, that the dictates of the Bible were far greater than any party platform, and yet they were not really listening to his words. They were merely enthusiastically responding to his presence. Richard John Neuhaus at a Christian Coalition meeting in 1994 is like Mick Jagger at a Boomer convention or something, right? It just, everybody going crazy. Apologies to all boomers in the room. After all, this was the famously fearsome Father Neuhaus, culture war extraordinaire, neoconservative Catholic priest and editor-in-chief of First Things magazine, the heroic and hilarious blade-sharp scourge of silly and soft liberals inside the churches most everywhere else. But as much as Neuaus enjoyed the stab and spike vitalities of professional opinion makings, and indeed he enjoyed these, carrying out his vocation as a priest was more important than burnishing his profile as a punchy public intellectual. That was why, that September 1994 day in Washington, he challenged his audience to put not their trust in princes, Republican or otherwise. Following his remarks, one of his listeners approached him, someone who had in fact heard what Neuhaus had said and was upset by it. As Neuhaus recalled, the man was holding back tears as he confronted the very priest and commentator whose writings had inspired him to become involved as a Christian in political activity. The same priest and commentator who was now telling him to take great care as a Christian involved in politics. Reflecting on the doubly confused experience of religion in American life that he witnessed and was part of, a conventional hall full of Christian Republicans, untroubled, indeed energized, by the seemingly mutual supports of their faith and party affiliation, and then one man so suddenly troubled that he wondered if anything could be done in politics as a Christian, Neuhaus wrote, quote, "Christian political engagement is an endlessly difficult subject. Our Lord said to render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's, but he did not accommodate us by spelling out the details." Over 2,000 years, Neuaus continued, Christians have again and again thought they got the mix just right, only to have it blow up in their faces, and not so incidentally, in the faces of others. We're always having to go back to the drawing board, which is to say, to first things. Even when, especially when, we are most intensely engaged in the battle, first things must be kept first in mind. It is not easy, but it is imperative. It profits us nothing if we win all the political battles while losing our own souls. Richard John Neuhaus' life and work attend to the endless difficult battles and necessarily imperfect victories of Christian political engagement in modern American culture and politics, whether we understand him as a leading clergyman of the American left in the 1960s and 70s, or as the most prominent clergyman of the American right from the 1980s through to his death in 2009. Now, if Neuhaus always understood himself foremost as a man of God, he was regarded by colleagues, collaborators, critics, friends, congregations, parishes, and the national media as, hang on, a theologian, an intellectual, an activist, an ecumist, a writer, an editor, a cultural commentator, a political pundit, a political candidate, a policy expert, a religious journalist, a religious leader, a spiritual director, a spiritual father, a teacher, a pastor, and a priest. The multiplicity corresponds to the array of efforts Neuhaus made over decades, and in any number of contexts, to bring Judeo-Christian concepts of human dignity, worth, and purpose to bear on every dimension of American public life, meaning the nation's leading sacred and secular institutions, its political, legislative, and judicial deliberations, its intellectual milieu, and media landscape. For all that he attempted and accomplished, Neuhaus was admired and scorned, closely followed and intensely imposed, and never but taken seriously. Late nights at his apartment on East 19th Street in Lower Manhattan, after dinner and evening prayer, Neuhaus liked to sit and hold forth, his Roman collar loosed, an old plaid shirt keeping him warm, a Baccarat cigar in one hand and a glass of old Weller bourbon in the other, his eyes twinkling and his mouth set to that lifelong wry grin. Bach would be playing on the stereo when his dog, whether Sammy or his successor, Sammy II, would be sleeping by the fireplace. And when Neuhaus was finally done with his authoritative statements on this and that and everything else that was right and wrong about America and Christianity, when he had stopped telling great old stories of his Canadian boyhood and his hell-raising days as a young man, when he had finished recounting his cherished times on the march with Martin Luther King and his meeting in the Oval Office with this president and dining in the papal apartment with that pope, Richard John Neuhaus would turn his attention to the very first of things. He would tell his friends that all his life he wanted to do something beautiful for God. My biography is the story of all that he tried and all that he did. So this story, as you can tell from how I ended that preface, ends in 2009 with Father Neuhaus' death, and upon his death he was the most prominent clergyman in America, well known in any number of contexts, specifically related to his work with First Things magazine, which I don't need to tell many of you about, I'm sure, but also because of his placement in national media and his direct involvement both with the papacy of John Paul II in an American context and also with the presidency of George W. Bush. That having been said, this was not fully his life and story. And so what I'd like to do is perhaps give you a larger overview of Neuhaus' trajectory. Many people only know him perhaps in that one kind of primary context. So I'd like to just say a little bit more about how he ended up there and some of the important elements along the way, Excuse me. And then we could take a little bit of some time for conversation. Oh, that's great. Thank you. I gave up hard liquor for Lent, and you gave me vodka, Tom. That's great. This is going to be more fun now. Anyway, so Neuhaus was born in 1936 in Pembroke, Ontario, a small town in the Ottawa Valley. He was born the seventh of 8 children of a Lutheran pastor. This is not the normal trajectory for a neoconservative Catholic priest. But Neuhaus was born into this small town in Canada where his father was a 6'5", 250-pound deer-hunting Lutheran pastor from Arkansas whose nickname was Pope Clem. Now, if you are a Missouri Synod Lutheran, that's a pretty loaded nickname. But it gives you a sense, I think, of just what an outsized presence this man had in this small town. You know, when I went there to interview people who knew Neuhaus and knew the family, there were old kind of, how to put this nicely, old and salty-tongued men who were kind of still hanging about the town. It's a lumber town, who could remember Pastor Neuhaus, meaning Neuhaus Sr., and they were still shaking. A 65-year-old man was shaking to tell me about the time Pastor Neuhaus came to his house because of how intimidating this man was. Neuhaus grows up in this world, and he grows up with two main things from the earliest age that he loved to do. He loved to make trouble, and he loved to play at church. And these two things kind of informed his childhood, which was a pretty idyllic childhood in 1930s, 1940s Canada. By the late 40s, his parents sent him off to Concordia, Nebraska, to a boarding school there. For those of you that know anything about Missouri Synod Lutherans, one of the things they imported from Germany was the gymnasium system, basically of a kind of extended sequence of schooling that began, sort of in junior high and went all the way through to junior college. So in his early teens, Neuhaus was sent off to Concordia, Nebraska, and he distinguished himself there very quickly for two reasons. Number one, at the age of 12, he was already preaching sermons to his fellow students in the dormitories. Number two, he was the person known on campus for organizing keg parties and panty raids. And again, troublemaking, and at the same time, really driven by his love of God. These things didn't work out very well at a Lutheran boarding school in the 1940s, as you could imagine. And after 1 year of activities there, Neuhaus was invited not to return. He was further invited not to return home. And so instead, his parents shipped him to Cisco, Texas, which is best known for being the birthplace of Conrad Hilton, the hotel magnate. And Neuhaus spent a couple of knockabout years in Cisco, Texas, where he was supposed to be enrolled in a high school down there. He never went to high school. He had two elderly kind of relatives taking care of him, and he just kind of hung around all day long. His granduncle was a World War II vet who had come back from Germany with a hoard of Nazi war memorabilia. Neuhaus found it and spent his days throwing Nazi war daggers against the ivory handled against garage doors and things. And he used this double-barreled shotgun to drive around the Texas Badlands shooting jackrabbits. What does this tell us? This tells, and at night, what would he do, as I learned from his roommate in those days? He would keep his roommate up at all hours talking about theology, talking about God. Same pattern, right? Here's someone with a lot of energy to burn, who clearly, if you don't give him the right framework for it, is going to cause a lot of trouble. Even when you give him the right framework, he's going to cause a lot of trouble. Eventually, the local pastor, who was driven crazy by this teenager who was constantly asking him theological questions, sent Neuhaus off to college, to a junior college in Austin, Texas. And there his supreme confidence only continued. He gets there, day one, there are two lines. There's the line for high school graduates going directly into college, and then there's the line for kids going to the junior college to then graduate into college. Neuhaus walked over to the college line, showed up, goes to the front, and they say, we're really sorry, but we don't have your high school transcript. And he said, I supremely hope that is remedied someday. And then he just walked in. So he had a little bit of Jesuit in him, is what we could say. But Neuhaus enters. It's amazing how a Jesuit joke always goes over well, no matter where I am. But anyway, Neuhaus goes into junior college, into regular college, I should say, Concordia, Texas, and he has a thriving time there. Once again, the same pattern. He's a campus troublemaker. He starts writing, which matters, for the campus newspaper and all, and he slowly begins to discern that he has a call to religious life, to becoming a minister such as his father was. And now is where really we get into the kind of more meaningful elements in Neuhaus's life story, I think. He is admitted from Concordia, Texas, to Concordia, St. Louis. Some of you may know Concordia, St. Louis. It is the flagship seminary for the Missouri Synod. And in the 1950s, this was quite a place. This was a thriving place in the 1950s, bursting at the seams. Teddy Roosevelt's famous sleeping giant comment about Missouri Lutheranism was sort of really at play right now. This was a place to be. But it was also a place of great foment. So by the 1950s, at a place like Concordia, St. Louis, you already had symptomatic divisions showing up in academic life, in the culture of the place, between Lutherans who understood themselves as part of American Protestantism, with far more kind of sympathy and interest in a fundamentalist view in biblical inerrancy. And then you had others, a minority, who were far more interested in a small c Catholic understanding of Lutheranism that encouraged a greater sense of liturgical practice in line with the Universal Catholic Church. Neuhaus was far more drawn to the latter. And his principal mentor at Concordia St. Louis was a man named Arthur C. Peepcorn. And this is, I think, a very important point to understand about Father Neuhaus. Peepcorn subscribed to a minority view within Lutheranism, that Lutheranism itself was a reform movement internal to the Universal Catholic Church, that it was never meant to lead to a permanent breakage, but that it was really an attempt to point out wrongs at play in the church in the 16th century and then call for an internal reunification. But that was a minority view, but it was one that Neuhaus was very much drawn to. As he was drawn to the sacramental approach that Peepcorn took, Peepcorn wore a Roman collar, etc., etc. That was one key element, and then the other, which is perhaps just as important, is he was drawn to urban ministry. And those two things came together when he answered a call to a broken-down church in Brooklyn as a young man in the 60s, and it was there that Neuhaus really kind of found his moment. It was a poor, majority black and Puerto Rican congregation in Brooklyn, Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and Neuhaus turned that place around. The original white congregation had left with all the money and even with the kind of the charter to the congregation, and Neuhaus, and it was right across the street from a major public housing project. It was a poor, broken down place. Neuhaus turned it around. How did he turn it around? Not with social programs, but with liturgy and community, and that was what informed everything else. Shortly thereafter, he emerged on the national scene in two areas. Number one, civil rights, and he eventually worked, accurately, he worked with people who work with Martin Luther King, although he usually put a little bit of an ellipses in between the people who worked with. And number two, he became a leading advocate for a kind of the religious left and its response to the war in Vietnam. He was a co-founder with a rabbi and two Jesuits, the Berrigan brothers of Paul Simon fame, and others, and a group of other mainline Protestants in the most prominent religious anti-war organization of the 60s and 70s, the clergy and laity concerned against the war in Vietnam. This was how Neuhaus became a national figure. In the meantime, he starts writing for any number of different publications, whether Lutheran, secular, the New York Review of Books, Commonweal. He's really now starting to kind of fire on all engines. But by the mid-70s, something happens. Please note, I skipped right over Roe v. Wade, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. By the mid-70s, what does Neuhaus realize? He realizes that his friends on the left, his kind of colleagues on the left, had a different view of things. The war's coming to an end. Hanoi falls to a communist government. It's 1975, and the early reports are that the new communist government in Vietnam is imprisoning religious minorities, Buddhists and Christians. Neuhaus looks at this and thinks, is this what we were marching against? Is this the injustice that we were trying to end? So he went to his friends on the left and he said, look, we need to do something. We need to sign a petition. We need to put a statement in the Times. And they wouldn't do it. They would not come out against a communist government in public. And that was when Neuhaus, putting first things first, realized that for many of his colleagues on the left, their ideological commitments trumped their theological commitments. And that, rather than Roe v. Wade, was the primary reason why he began to go from left to right. This led to and why is that? Because in the 70s, as I'm sure many of you know, it was entirely respectable to be a liberal pro-lifer. In fact, it was the angry conservatives who wanted there to be less babies and less people on welfare. And so for Neuhaus, there wasn't really nearly as much of a significance in that case, although, of course, abortion became a major matter for him later in life. As the 70s lead to the 80s, Neuhaus becomes increasingly prominent now as a critic of mainline Protestantism, which he saw as kind of abandoning its ecclesial and theological principles for social relevance and political activism. He is himself moving increasingly towards a greater fidelity with the Catholic Church, which begins with a great admiration for John Paul II and his fight against communism, and his, indeed, sort of call to a first things view of the world. Small f, small t, first things. By 1984, Neuhaus really kind of emerges as a main figure because of The Naked Public Square, his most famous book. It comes out in the middle of a presidential election where there was a great debate over what it meant for Christians to become politically active. This had everything to do with Jerry Falwell and the moral majority, and then with its critics who pointed out, we have a separation of church and state in this country. We don't want Christians getting involved this way. Neuaus comes out with The Naked Public Square and basically says, a pox on both your houses. You're both wrong. The fundamentalists are wrong because they can offer no publicly available account for the right ordering of American public life. They simply say, the Bible says this and you believe this, so therefore you do that. This is not plausible or persuasive in a pluralist democracy. In the meantime, the secularists reject any attempt to draw on one's religiously informed principles to contribute to public life, which directly contradicts the reality of a pluralist democracy and indeed the First Amendment. Neuhaus becomes a national figure with The Naked Public Square, and thereafter becomes a fixture in the morning news, on the newspapers, and the editorial pages, etc., etc. By 1989, he makes national news by converting from Lutheranism to Roman Catholicism. This was such a big deal in his family that his sisters drove and flew from Florida and Washington State to small-town Canada to be with his mother for when the news broke. And they got there, and the news had already broke. And they walk into the kitchen, and this mother of a Lutheran pastor, this wife of a Lutheran pastor says, so Richard became a Catholic. And that was it. That's all she ever said about it. And then she moved on. With a voluble son, maybe that's all she needed to say. It's around that time, as I'm sure many of you know, that Neuhaus founded First Things magazine, which became and continues to be really America's premier journal for a religiously informed understanding of politics, religion, culture, economics. What was that magazine really about? It was about recognizing that there was a community of religiously serious thinkers, writers, and readers who were looking for a platform to understand and explore these issues out of their own first things principles, I guess you could say. And so from the 90s onward, Neuhaus becomes very much sort of well-known for first things, becomes infamous for it, of course, in 1996, when he presided over an issue of the magazine called The End of Democracy ? Which questioned the legitimacy of American democracy itself in light of recent judicial opinions related to end-of-life matters. He committed the supreme error of making a very awkward invocation of Nazi Germany in order to critique judicial tyranny, and this kind of brought the house down, created a lot of fights on the American right, and led to a lot more subscriptions to First Things, which wasn't bad. In 1999, Neuhaus gets a call from a guy named, Karl Rove, a guy named Karl Rove, who says to him, I work for this governor down in Texas who's thinking about running for president. You want to come for lunch? So Neuhaus goes to the governor's mansion and meets with then Governor Bush, and they begin to chatting. And Neuhaus basically provides Bush, rather explicitly, with the formulations and the informed understanding behind them that would activate conservative Catholic voters in the 2000 election who broke more for Bush than for Gore. And Neuhaus becomes, as a result of this, a known counselor to President Bush, specifically on social matters, Meanwhile, First Things itself becomes a venue where just war theory is deployed in support of the war on terror and then the Iraq War. This begins to create the perception, not inaccurate at times, that Neuhaus was too close to the Republican Party, too much of a defender and apologist for the Bush administration, or at least created a venue for as much. And he came in for a lot of criticism as a result of this. The idea that he was nothing more than a Republican in a Roman collar is inaccurate, I think. That takes it a little too far. One of the things that my biography points out is the private correspondence that Neuhaus had with Bush, where he basically said, look, you got us through this election, but if we don't see any evidence of your commitment to pro-life matters, we walk. We don't go to the Democrats, we're just not going to vote for you next time. So he was pretty clear that way. He was very much keen to make a religiously informed understanding part of the response to 9/11. And over the 2000s, though, he becomes increasingly an opponent, or increasingly a foe of the secular left and the religious left. You know, there was a Neuhaus watch going on in certain secular newsletters and things because he was considered so dangerous. And by 2009, he contracts cancer for a second time and passes away, leaving behind him any number of important sort of people he'd mentored, vocations, books he'd written, communities he'd started, think tanks, magazines, etc., etc. But I think the main thing to remember in all of this is that throughout the 90s and the 2000s, while he was hanging out with John Paul II in Rome, and he was talking to President Bush, and he was on Meet the Press, and he was in the Times, he was an associate pastor at a Filipino parish in Lower Manhattan. And he was there every Sunday he was in town and for daily mass, and then he would go off to the offices of First Things. And when I went there and spoke to his parishioners, what was amazing was how completely indifferent they were to everything I've just told you about. For them, he was Father Neuhaus. Oh yeah, he's on TV sometimes. They shrug. They understood him as their pastor, and I'd like to think that Neuhaus himself, at the beginning and the end, understood himself foremost as a man of God. And in that way, I think he provides for us a continuing example of what it means to be a religiously serious person trying to live out one's vocation in American public life. Thank you.